Before we begin, if you're settling in for the night, take a moment to get comfortable, okay? If you're new here, welcome to Boring History for Sleepwear. The stories are slow, strange, and just detailed enough to help you drift off. If you enjoy these calm, quiet journeys into forgotten history, consider subscribing. And let us know in the comments, what time is it where you are, and where in the world you're listening from. We read every one now. Let's begin. Asterisk in the late 19th century. Britain had a surplus of children, not in homes or in loving families, but in the streets. They scurried through soot-covered alleys and slept in doorways warmed by bakery ovens. They were children with names no one remembered and faces that quickly blended into the gray. Most had lost one or both parents, softened to consumption, cholera, or poverty itself, and found themselves in institutions called ragged schools. Poorhouses, or worse, in no institution at all. In the eyes of the Victorian elite, they were a problem to be solved. And what better solution than to ship them away between the 1860s and the 1970s? Over 100,000 British children were sent abroad as part of official and semi-official child migration schemes. Most went to Canada, Australia, and other parts of the British Empire. Key, and the logic, while chilling, was efficient. Send the children where labor was needed, where colonies were growing, and where no one would ask too many questions at the time. Industrial Britain was choking on its own contradictions. While its wealth expanded, its cities collapsed inward. Housing was scarce, chimneys narrow, soup thinned with water, and children, particularly those from the working or destitute classes, became symbols of both national shame and national opportunity. In the East End of London, rows of children lined up at charity-run homes every morning, some with no shoes, some without birth certificates, all of them waiting for something: a meal, a job, a reason to be noticed. Philanthropic organizations like Dr. Bernardo's Homes, the Salvation Army, and various church missions stepped in with a solution they considered both moral and economical. They would remove the child from squalor and place them in an environment of hard work, fresh air, and Christian values. But the air would not be British, and the work would not be easy. It started with forms neatly filled by clergymen, missionaries, or staff workers who rarely knew the children well. Boxes ticked, healthy enough to travel, trainable, male or female, gauged, guess. Most files didn't include birthdays, and the children were too young to know, or too beaten down to correct. The term often used was immigration, but too many children. It felt more like being crated. Before leaving, the child was washed, photographed, and sometimes given a change of clothes or uniform that identified them as a Bernardo's boy or a Quarry's girl. They were not asked if they wanted to go. The journey itself was presented as a gift. You're going to a better life. Most did not believe it. They had learned long ago not to argue with adults holding ledgers. The ship voyages varied in length depending on destination. Canada was harsh but relatively close. Australia was a month away. Children were grouped by age and sex, housed in dormitories aboard merchant ships that also carried coal, butter, or tobacco. They slept in bunks or hammocks, depending on the year, and were kept occupied with Bible readings, drills, and basic chores to keep them from wandering the decks. They did not see the ocean as beautiful. Many arrived seasick, scared, or simply confused. They had been told they were going to live with new families, that they'd be adopted, that they'd have beds, meals, and futures. But what many of them found instead were fields, workhouses, or isolated farmsteads. Some were taken in by families with kindness. Others were treated as little more than indentured laborers, expected to work in exchange for food and shelter, but never love. The receiving countries had their own motivations. Canada, in particular, welcomed the flow of home children believing them to be a valuable source of cheap rural labor. The notion was that these children would assimilate, become productive, and build lives where their parents had failed. But most never fully adjusted. Some ran away, others stayed silent, and many disappeared from records altogether. The British public, for the most part, applauded the efforts. Newspaper articles praised the rescue of these children, and pamphlets were printed with smiling photos of boys plowing fields or girls holding dolls in tidy, new frocks. But no one printed the photo of the child who was never adopted, or the one sent back on a return ship in disgrace, or the one who died in the snow a few miles from the house that claimed to be his home. And yet, it was the silence that lingered most. Few letters were sent, fewer returned, records were lost, burned, or never made. And for the children who lived through it, the years often blurred into a memory of hard floors, cold mornings, and names they were told to forget. Some children were never told where they were going. Others were promised they would return soon. Most never did, and so it began, not with fanfare or ceremony, but with silence and paperwork, with a child's name written in ink that faded long before their memory did. But what did it feel like, truly, to be shipped away before you knew what belonging meant? And what did it cost the empire to treat children like spare furniture sent, to fill the corners of its faraway rooms? Asterisk, it began early. It did, often before the frost had melted from the windows. British home children, those sent abroad in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, woke not to the warmth of familiar arms, but to the bark of a stranger, the creak of uninsulated floorboards, or the clang of a farm bell calling them to work. Some were as young as 6 in the Canadian provinces. The mornings bit hard. Winter didn't ask whether a child had gloves. On farms outside Ontario, in distant outposts near Moose Jaw, or along the edge of Nova Scotia, these boys sent as laborers were expected to prove their usefulness quickly. They were adopted, yes, but not in the sense most imagine. Adoption papers were rarely signed. Love wasn't part of the deal. In many cases, were placement contracts that lasted until the child turned 18. They fetched water, chopped wood, milked cows, harvested hay, and carried pails half their weight. They were not family, they were help. The girls were often placed in domestic service, cooking, cleaning, caring for younger children, scrubbing floors with lye. Some lived in homes where they were tolerated. Others served under mistresses who treated them as lesser beings. The phrase charity girl became a shorthand insult in some rural towns, mocking the fact that the child had come from abroad with no family, no status, and no claim to real kinship. These children were often forbidden to speak of their pasts. They were told to be grateful, to smile in front of guests, to recite their catechisms and swallow their doubts. Some were punished for crying. Others were punished for speaking in a Cockney accent that embarrassed their host families. And yet, some did find moments of peace. A kind woman might offer warm bread after a long day. A neighbor boy might share a joke, a whistle, or a secret spot by the lake. Small mercies in a world that had mostly forgotten they were still just children. The Canadian government tracked few of them after placement. Once a child had been handed off to a household, oversight was minimal. Specters were supposed to visit once a year, but many didn't. Reports went unread. Complaints went unfiled. Some boys vanished entirely from records, likely having run away, died, or changed names to escape the shame of their beginnings. Australia's home children faced a different kind of isolation. Many were placed not with families, but in rural farm schools, vast compounds that trained orphans in agriculture, obedience, and self-reliance. The most notorious among them was Fairbridge Farm School in Western Australia, founded by Kingsley Fairbridge, a Rhodes Scholar whose dream of nurturing country children in the sunshine quickly turned into something far less romantic. At Fairbridge and similar institutions, children woke early, marched in drills, attended church services, and spent hours maintaining crops or machinery. Education was minimal. Its contact with family, if any, was restricted. Physical punishment was frequent and sometimes severe. The goal was to produce good, strong workers, not thinkers, not questioners, not children with memories. And then there were the beatings. Not everywhere, not in every home or institution, but enough for thousands of children to later come forward in adulthood, decades after their childhood had passed, to speak of the cruelty they had endured. Beatings with belts, isolation in sheds, scrubbing outhouses as punishment for minor disobedience. In some cases, sexual abuse. These stories surfaced not in the 19th century, but in the 1990s and 2000s, when former child migrants finally gave voice to what they had suffered in silence. Why did no one stop it? The truth is, it was easy not to see. The children had no power, no parents, and no one to speak on their behalf. Governments benefited from their labor. Charities raised funds from their images. And the public, often so convinced of the righteousness of empire and mission, rarely asked what happened after the smiling photo faded. The agencies that sent them Bernardos, a Church of England, the Salvation Army, were not inherently malicious. Most were filled with people who believed in their cause. But belief is not a safeguard against negligence, and optimism, untethered from accountability, can do quiet and enduring harm. The children were told they were part of a grand experiment, a better life, a clean slate, but a clean slate erases everything. For many, their records were lost or destroyed. Their identities rewritten, birth dates guessed, siblings scattered across provinces and continents, never to reunite. Some children were told their parents were dead when they were not. Others were told they had no family, only to discover decades later that a mother had searched, written letters, and pleaded for information, and so they worked. Through winters and droughts, through adolescence, through birthdays that passed unnoticed. They made beds in barns and memorized the sound of unfamiliar trees rustling at night, and they slowly forgot the smell of London smog or the echo of St. Paul's from far away. The home children were not criminals. They were not unwanted. They were simply miscategorized, turned from people into paperwork, shuffled from file to file, ship to ship, and still, most did not rebel. Most did not write angry letters or run to the newspapers. They endured. That quiet endurance, the kind that doesn't shout or spark headlines. It's the kind that gets lost in history. But it was there, in the way they learned to chop wood in silence, to eat without speaking, to thank their new families, even when unsure what they were thankful for. Some became farmers. Some drifted into cities. Some changed their names and lived whole lives never mentioning they had once been cargo in an imperial pipeline. Others grew old, wondering what would life have been like if I had stayed. Asterisk as the 20th century pressed forward through wars, economic collapse, and the reordering of empires. Those children who had once been bundled off like excess inventory grew into adults who carried no clear label. They had names, of course, but the names changed. From William to Bill, from Eliza to Elsie, sometimes by choice, more often by circumstance, a misspelled document, a foster family's whim, a clerk too tired to ask for clarification. Many didn't know their real birthdays. Some weren't sure of their parents' full names. Some didn't even remember what they'd looked like died in Canada. Home children made up a quiet, unseen workforce by the early 20th century. It's estimated that more than 10% of the population has roots in these child migrants. But few celebrated this heritage. It wasn't something passed down like a treasured heirloom, was hidden away like a dented pot at the back of the cupboard. Why? Because shame travels through silence. The shame of being sent away, of having no family claim, of being told you were lucky to have been rescued, even when you hadn't asked for it, of working for free in someone else's barn while other children play. It is difficult to be proud of a survival you were never meant to talk about, and yet many did survive. Some flourished. They became shopkeepers, farmers, teachers, mechanics. They raised children who never knew how hard their parents' beginnings had been. They built homes of their own homes, where birthdays were remembered, where children were hugged for no reason at all. But not all of them made peace. In Australia, the reckoning came late. It wasn't until the late 1980s and 1990s that the voices of former child migrants broke into public consciousness. Quiet men in their 70s, women long retired, suddenly came forward to say, "We were hurt, we were taken, and no one ever asked if we wanted to go." The stories were collected, inquiries were held, one in 1997, another in 2001, and then again in 2009, in that final year. The Australian Prime Minister at the time, Kevin Rudd, issued a formal apology to the forgotten Australians, those who had been raised in institutional or out-of-home care, including child migrants. His voice cracked as he said, "To those who were sent away, we say sorry." The United Kingdom followed in 2010. Prime Minister Gordon Brown acknowledged in an official address that the policy of child migration had been deeply flawed, that it had caused suffering, that it had been implemented with little understanding of the cost. But how do you apologize for decades of silence, for the birthdays missed, for the letters burned, for the siblings separated by thousands of miles in dozens of years? Some former migrants traveled back to Britain in their later years. They stood on the steps of Bernardo's homes or the Quarriers village and stared at walls that hadn't seen their small shadows in 70 years. They searched archives for records that didn't exist. They tried to find photos, documents, anything that could stitch together the gaps in their lives. And some found nothing. Only blank pages. Only names they didn't recognize. Others located birth parents who had died long ago, or siblings who never knew they'd existed. Reunions were sometimes joyful, often awkward, and always heavy with the weight of time that could never be reclaimed. In museums across the UK, Canada, and Australia today, small exhibits mark the era of child migration. A wooden trunk, Katie, uniform, a photograph of a boy too young to understand what exile means. Visitors pass through, sometimes lingering, sometimes not. The world has no shortage of tragedies. And this one quiet, bureaucratic, cloaked in the language of charity, was not as dramatic as war, or as swift as plague. But it lingers, because this tragedy wore a smile. It wrapped children in warm coats before boarding them on ships. It used words like opportunity, training, placement, It gave them oatmeal and Bibles and a new name, and then it took away everything else. Some might ask, was it better than life on the streets? Was it better than the workhouse? But that is not the question history leaves us with. The question is, why did no one ask the children what they wanted? And what does it mean when a nation builds its empire on the backs of the smallest and the most voiceless without ever acknowledging the cost? Asterisk, you're standing at the edge of the River Mersey in Liverpool. It's late spring, 1903. The fog hangs thick over the wharf, caught in the beams of the early morning sun. Crates of canned meat, tools, and woolen cloth sit waiting to be hoisted onto cargo ships bound for Canada. Among them, another kind of shipment waits silently rows of children, mostly boys, dressed in identical brown wool suits and caps far too big for their thin frames. They do not talk much. Some fidget, a few yawn, but most are still. They are the immigration party of that month, dozens of them. The staff from the home call it a success. After all, Each one of these boys is a child saved from destitution in London, Manchester, or Glasgow, taken from the streets, cleaned, clothed, and processed. Now, they are cargo. They hold paper tags tied around their necks like luggage labels. The tags list their names, even misspelled, and their assigned destination farms. A boy might be bound for a family near Toronto, another toward the prairies. Another might not know exactly where he's going and are lonely that he's been told to smile and obey. These children were gathered by a mix of agencies: the National Children's Home, Barnardo's, the Catholic Immigration Society. Each group believed it was offering a better future. But hey, and in some ways, they were right. But few ever asked what the journey itself would do to a child's mind before leaving. Most of the children had undergone weeks, sometimes months of preparation. They were housed in large institutions called receiving homes, where they were taught basic hygiene, given lessons in Christian morality, and drilled in simple farm tasks. Here, obedience was the golden rule. Don't ask too many questions. Resist the rules. Don't cry at night. The children were given medical checks, lice combs, uniforms. For many, it was the first time they had received anything brand new. And yet, there was something cold about it all, as if the entire process was not about the child, but about how to make the child more acceptable to the world that would receive him. And then, the boat, the SS Sardinian, the RMS Dominion, the SS Tunisian. Ships that carried everything from mail to munitions, but nestled in their lower decks were always the orphaned, the unwanted, the unclaimed. Steerage class, in steerage. The air smelled of iron and sweat. The boys were stacked in long, narrow dormitories lined with bunk beds, sometimes 3 or 4 high. Ventilation was poor, the sea unpredictable. Vomit in the night. Rats on the rafters. Cold water for washing. Meals served in tin dishes and eaten quickly to avoid fights. But there was routine. Wake up at 6, Bible study by 7, clean the dormitories, line up for inspections. The staff called it discipline. The children knew it as survival. Those with sea legs helped care for the younger ones. Those who couldn't stop vomiting often lay in silence, their faces pale and lips dry. There was little comfort, but there was order. And in that order, a kind of numbness took root. Child's mind finds ways to protect itself when the world no longer offers choices. The ocean was not a place of wonder. It was a vast stretch of gray boredom and endless waiting. Some boys stared out through portholes, wondering where they were going. Others focused on the floor beneath their boots and tried not to think of anything at all. What little possessions they had were stored in a single box: a Bible, a handkerchief, perhaps a photo of a mother long since buried. The rest was memory, and memory, like salt water, rose slowly. By the second week, the ship entered the colder Atlantic currents. The boys were told to wear their coats. The decks were slick with spray. And as they neared Canada, the mood began to shift, not to excitement, but to anxious stillness. It was the unknown again, a second uprooting. First from their homeland, and now from the ship that had become a floating orphanage. At Quebec or Halifax, they disembarked in groups, lined up, counted, tagged again. Officials from Canadian immigration offices met them at the docks. A few took notes. Others barely looked at the children. After all, they weren't refugees. They weren't criminals. They were something else entirely: orphans, meant to be distributed in warehouses or way stations. The boys were processed: a bath, a checkup, a spoon of castor oil if the ship's food had left them ill. Some were sent to distribution homes, like the Knowlton home in Quebec or the Marchmont home in Belleville, where they would be held briefly before being placed out. The language of these institutions is cold, and deliberately so. Placed out like furniture, like goods in a catalog. A farmer would come and select a boy based on age, size, and health. Not personality, not background, not tenderness, just what he could lift, how long he could work, how likely he was to survive a Canadian winter. For the lucky few, the placement brought kindness, a warm bed, second chance at childhood. For others, it was the beginning of years of labor, silence, and forgetfulness. And all of it began on that dock in Liverpool, where they were lined up like crates ready to be shipped, sorted, and put to use. What does it do to a child to cross an ocean before they've learned how to feel at home? And more quietly still, what did Britain lose in sending its youngest and poorest away before asking what they might one day become? It's asterisk, once the ships had vanished behind them and the thin coats had already stopped being warm. The boys were handed over like borrowed tools, one by one, in places like Ontario's rural towns or Nova Scotia's small farming communities. These children, fresh off the ship, stomachs still unsteady, were quietly delivered into homes by cart or train. Some had only a name and a direction. Others rode alone for hours to reach farms where their new lives would begin. Unceremoniously, there was no welcome committee, no speech of encouragement, no choice. They were not children in the traditional sense anymore. Not sons, not brothers, not students, were placed out boys. The families who received them had been given a list of rules. Feed the child, clothe the child, let him attend church, and, if possible, school. Let an inspector visit once per year. Do not beat him beyond reason. That last clause was printed delicately. Beyond reason. But who decided what was reasonable? These placements were not adoptions, They were more like work exchanges, disguised in the language of Christian duty. The child was to help with chores, in exchange for being raised. No pay, lumber, promises of inheritance, no guarantees of kindness. In legal terms, the child was often a ward. In practice, he was a servant. A boy of 12 might be sent to shovel manure. Cow would feed livestock and haul water before breakfast. A boy of 8 might be given the care of younger children, not because he was mature, but because there was no one else to do it. Winter came early in Canada, and with it, isolation, long nights, quiet punishments. The homes were varied. Some were rough-hewn cabins with creaking doors and single fireplaces. Others were larger farms run with military precision. A few were kind, many were not. Some boys slept in barns. Some were forbidden from entering the family parlor. Eans were taken at separate tables. Sundays, they sat quietly on pews beside strangers who referred to them not by name, but as the home child. When inspectors did come, often just once per year, the children were warned ahead of time. Smile, say you're happy. Don't cause trouble, and many did, out of fear, out of habit, out of confusion about what truth would even sound like anymore. There was no appeal process for most placements. If a child ran away, he risked being labeled ungrateful or unfit. If he complained, his letter might be intercepted. If he fell ill, the family might return him to the agency like defective goods. One boy was reportedly sent back because he cried at night. Another because he broke a tool by accident. Some were passed from family to family, like unwanted parcels in a forgotten mailroom. And yet, there were exceptions. Here and there, a family welcomed the child in true spirit. A boy might be given a real bed, a place at the dinner table, perhaps even called son. Some former home children later recalled those homes with warmth where laughter was allowed, where birthdays were remembered, where discipline did not come with bruises. But these were the exception. Most grew up in a suspended place, neither fully British nor fully Canadian. Orphaned, yes, but also emptied of the small rituals that make life bearable. A hug after a long day, a hand on the shoulder, someone calling your name just to say goodnight. The girls, in their own placements, faced their own distinct hardships. Many were assigned as domestic help, often to households overwhelmed with babies, laundry, and silence. Some were treated kindly. Others faced verbal or physical abuse. Some became pregnant by men of the household and were quickly removed and returned to the agency, disgraced, forgotten, often blamed. These were not isolated cases. They were threaded through thousands of individual histories. The paperwork, when it survived, often used vague phrases: unsuitable, return to sender, behavioral issues. But no one asked, who taught her how to feel safe? Who listened to what he couldn't say? One of the cruelest ironies was that many of these children believed they would be adopted. That promise lingered in the air as they crossed the Atlantic. Adoption, in the modern sense, was rarely practiced. Most placements ended at age 18, and the boy or girl was told they had aged out of care. And then, again, they were alone. Some stayed in the towns where they had worked. Others left and tried to bury their pasts. A few tracked down siblings placed elsewhere, only to find that the years had made them strangers. For every family that offered a second chance, there were others who offered only survival: food, bed, work, nothing more. But what did these boys think about when the candles burnt down? When the snow pressed against the windows and the sound of wolves howled faintly in the Canadian dark? Did they remember their real names? Their mother's voice? The docks at Liverpool? Did they remember how many other children stood with them in line, only to vanish into the long quiet of the countryside? Or did they let it all dissolve, like ice melting into spring, hoping no one would ever ask them to remember what they were? Too young to understand. Asterisk time has a way of erasing edges. What was once a painful memory becomes vague. What was once a home becomes a name on a form. And for the thousands of children shipped across the Atlantic as part of Britain's great child migration schemes, time didn't just blur the past, it buried it. By the mid-20th century, the policy of placing British orphans in Canadian homes began to quietly recede. War changed everything. Immigration rules tightened, and public interest shifted elsewhere. But no grand announcement was made. No ceremony marked the final shipment. The last boy to disembark in Halifax in the late 1940s had no idea. He was the final child in a chain that had lasted more than 70 years. No one told him. No one asked if he was ready. No one looked back. And so he stepped into the cold, into a world built for people who already belonged. He did not. By then, the earlier generations of home children were already aging. Some had married, had children, opened shops, or joined the army. Others remained on the margins, still living in rented rooms, still walking with that slight inward curve of the shoulders of posture learned from years of being told not to take up space. The stigma followed them in Canada. Many home children kept their origins a secret. They avoided discussing where they came from. They told their children they had grown up on a farm, but not why they were sent there. The term home child became a quiet insult in some places' code for unwanted, rough, other. And so, generations grew up never knowing they were descendants of this massive social experiment. The documents, when they existed, were difficult to access. Some children were listed under different names. Some were misfiled, misdated, or simply lost in floods, fires, or the careless turnover of government departments. The silence became generational. What began as secrecy became amnesia. It wasn't until the 1980s that the story began to reemerge. Not in textbooks, not in public schools, but in whispered conversations, in newspaper letters, in community groups of older men and women who began to ask one another, "Were you a home child too?" They began to gather, in libraries, in small halls. Okay, they brought photographs, some grainy, some staged, certificates from receiving homes, a Bible, with a child's name inside. And slowly, the fragments formed a picture of something large, painful, and hidden. Historians began to listen. Asterisk, the numbers were staggering. Over 100,000 children sent from Britain to Canada between 1869 and 1948, and similar numbers, smaller but still shocking proportions, to Australia, South Africa, and New Zealand, all in the name of empire, charity, and efficiency. Canada, to its credit, began to acknowledge the past. Some towns erected plaques. A few schools included lessons. Archives were opened. Family tracing services were established. But for many home children, it was too late. The families they longed to find were gone. The truths they needed had dissolved in dust. Asterisk. In Britain, the records were more difficult to navigate. Some were sealed, some destroyed. Even institutions that had long since closed held on to silence more tightly than paper. What makes a historical tragedy so difficult to face is not just the suffering itself, but the bureaucratic indifference that allowed it to continue for so long. This wasn't a hidden crime. It wasn't a secret. It was a policy published, defended, repeated under the banner of progress. And yet, there were glimmers of resistance, even then. A few journalists questioned the practice. A few clergymen voiced discomfort. Some social workers tried to protect children from harsh placements, but there were exceptions, and they were often ignored. It would take until 2010, over 60 years after the last child had been sent away for a formal apology, to come from the British government. Prime Minister Gordon Brown stood before Parliament and said, "To all those former child migrants and their families, we are truly sorry." But for many, the words came too late. Not because they were angry, but because they no longer remembered who to forgive. And for those still living, the men and women who once stood on Liverpool's docks with labels around their necks, the apology was not a resolution, a poem, an echo. Canada today, there are cemeteries with rows of unmarked graves belonging to home children. Boys who never made it past childhood. Girls who died in childbirth. Men and women whose names faded from memory before their voices were ever heard. Yet beneath the soil lies something else. 2. Resilience. Despite everything, despite being treated as freight, despite being forgotten, many of these children grew up to build the very world that ignored them. They helped pave Canada's roads, harvest its wheat, teach in its schools. They raised children with more love than they themselves had known. They carved dignity from systems that gave them none. There are no perfect endings in stories like this, only acknowledgments, only the soft sound of footsteps leaving the archive, the creak of old floorboards in a museum, the flicker of memory restored in an old man's eyes as he stares at a photo of himself, 8 years old, standing by a ship. So we ask not only how they endured, we ask, how did we not see them for what they were? Not cargo, not problems, not pity, but children. Asterisk, imagine standing at the edge of a continent you don't recognize. The sun is sharper. The wind carries dust instead of fog. And the soil deep ochre and rough beneath your borrowed shoes feels like another planet altogether. This was the first sensation for thousands of British children disembarking in Australia. From the late 1800s through the 1960s, most had never seen the sea before boarding the ship. Now, they stepped into a world where eucalyptus trees replaced oak, and the air smelled not of coal and rain, but of sun-scorched earth. Their journey had taken weeks, from Southampton or Liverpool, across oceans unfamiliar and unforgiving, to places like Fremantle, Sydney, or Adelaide. The voyage was filled with sickness, with Bible readings, with canned meats and hard biscuits, and with silence. But it was the arrival that truly bewildered them. There was no moment of awe, no wide-eyed excitement, only exhaustion and instructions. Many were brought ashore in groups, wearing identical wool uniforms in a climate they had not been warned about. Some collapsed from heat, others vomited from nerves. Still others simply stood still, staring at the brown world that now stretched before them without end in official reports. These children were often described as fresh stock, term usually reserved for animals. They were sent not to homes, but to institutions, places with names that sounded generous, cute, even hopeful. Bindoon, Fairbridge, Castledare, St. Joseph's Orphanage, to the outside world. These were beacons of Christian charity and moral training. In the fundraising leaflets sent back to Britain, the children were always smiling, lined up in neat rows, tanned and thriving. A new start, the captions read. A clean slate for children who had nothing. But the reality was far more silent. The Australian institutions that received these children were often underfunded, overworked, and far from major cities. They were built on land that needed taming. And the children, some as young as 4, told they had been chosen to help take at Fairbridge Farm School in Western Australia. The boys were expected to learn farming skills and self-reliance. What they mostly learned was obedience. Days began early, not with a gentle wake-up, but with bells and shouted orders. Beds were made with military precision. Meals were plain and brief. Schooling, if offered at all, came in the form of religious instruction and basic arithmetic. The goal wasn't education, it was transformation, from degenerate street child to useful colonial citizen. But who asked the child what he wanted to become? Girls, though fewer in number, often ended up in Catholic-run institutions like the Good Shepherd Convent or the Sisters of Mercy homes. Their routines were harsh, structured, and silent, scrubbing floors, ironing sheets, kneeling for hours in prayer. Any infraction, real or imagined, shoes were a privilege. So was sugar and tea. So was sugar and tea. So was speaking freely. Many of these children had been told they were orphans, that their families had died. In many cases, this wasn't true. Parents in Britain, overwhelmed, poor, institutionalized, had signed temporary custody agreements. But those agreements were often manipulated or lost. Wait, once the child was overseas, were nearly impossible to reverse. The sea made sure of that. Some children did try to write letters to mothers or siblings they dimly remembered. But the letters were monitored. Some were never sent. Others were returned to sender, unopened, or marked no forwarding address. And so, the silence grew. The Australian landscape, with its harsh beauty and brutal seasons, offered little comfort. Flies in the summer, cold concrete floors in the winter, whispers of snakes in the dry grass. The children began to adopt an inward sterile look of blank compliance that staff often misread as adjustment. But it wasn't. It was retreat. In the early years of the migration scheme, inspections were rare. The institutions operated with near-complete autonomy. Some were run by the people with good intentions, others by clergy or staff whose ideas of discipline bordered on cruelty. Corporal punishment was standard. Solitary confinement was common. In some homes, children were beaten for speaking out of turn or for failing to recite prayers. Others were subjected to labor punishments, digging holes, cleaning latrines, hauling stones for hours in the midday heat. The language used to describe them, wayward, quiteful, difficult, seldom accounted for trauma, confusion, or grief. These were children who had crossed oceans alone, who had been renamed, reframed, and reduced to paperwork. And yet, to the broader public, they were invisible. Australia's newspapers occasionally featured small stories about the latest shipment of child migrants, a tea, but they were treated like any other cargo cattle, wool, timber. Another dozen boys arrived from England this week to be housed in Bindoon and trained in farming. No names, no ages, no stories, just numbers, just usefulness. Some did adapt, some did grow strong. A few even learned to love the land, the big sky, the rustle of dry grass. The way the stars looked different from anything back home. But it took years, and it never came without loss. The loss of a name, the loss of language, the loss of trust and promises that had always arrived too late in the hot afternoons, when the work was done and the supervisors had retreated to their offices. The boys would sometimes sit in silence under the sparse shade of a gum tree, dust on their skin, thirst in their mouths, and a thought that returned again and again. Where am I? And who remembers me now? K. Asterisk. By the 1930s, Australia's child migrant institutions had settled into a rhythm. The machinery was well-oiled, shipments arrived, uniforms were handed out, beds were assigned. There were prayers before meals, drills in the yard, and rows of metal plates laid out like military issue. And behind it, all beneath the daily routine, was a quiet, constant ache, the kind of ache that comes from being entirely unclaimed. The boys at Bindu Mission, north of Perth, built much of the place with their own hands. It wasn't just that they were housed there. They were the labor, stone walls, roads, courtyards. They mixed cement under a blazing sun, moved rocks with blistered fingers, and slept at night on thin mattresses that bore no names. Their childhoods passed under an illusion of purpose. The brothers who ran the mission promised they were building character, building muscle, building futures. But what they were really building was a silence so deep that few would speak of it for decades. The Catholic-run institutions, such as Bindoon, Castledare, and Tartan, were especially strict. The boys were given religious names, expected to attend Mass regularly, and were punished swiftly for any sign of defiance. And yet, the punishments often came without explanation. A missed button, a torn shirt, a boy who asked too many questions. All could bring a strike of the cane or a week spent doing hard labor outside. Asterisk. In their quietest moments, some boys tried to imagine what they might have been in another life. A baker's apprentice, a tailor, maybe even a teacher. But in this red-soiled world, dreams were luxuries, and the only skill truly taught was endurance. The girls, placed in institutions like the Sisters of Mercy homes or the Good Shepherd laundries, faced their own routines, just as rigid, just as silent. They were trained to wash, iron, fold, and mend. Work that began before sunrise and ended long after dark. Asterisk. Some had been placed there as infants. Others were taken from single mothers who had been pressured or coerced into giving them up. Most were told they were orphans, even when they weren't. And as they grew into adolescence, the expectations became narrower. Obedience, chastity, silence. Girls who disobeyed were punished in isolation, sometimes for days. A locked cell, bread and water, a notebook to copy lines from scripture until the knuckles ached. For many, the only escape was time, and even then, time left its scars. But the deepest wounds weren't always physical. They came from the slow, methodical erosion of identity. A child who arrives in a foreign land and is told their past no longer matters eventually stops asking questions, stops remembering, stops hoping. This was the true damage of the migration experiment. Not just the labor, the beatings, or the sunburnt skin, but the psychic fracture of being treated like a mistake someone else had to manage. Australia's isolation played a role. These institutions were far from public view, hidden inland or tucked behind high walls. There were no drop-in visits from sympathetic relatives, no holidays with family, no neighbors who might report mistreatment. The children were surrounded by silence, inside and out. There were inspections, of course, official visitors from the Child Welfare Department, but they were often announced in advance. The beds were made tighter, the uniforms scrubbed, the punishments temporarily eased, and the children, warned sternly, kept their mouths shut. They learned how to present gratitude, to say, "Yes, brother," to bow their heads, to smile at the right moments, even when the smile had nothing behind it. And through it all, Australia believed it was doing something noble. Newspaper clippings praised the children's adjustment. Fundraising pamphlets back in Britain featured photos of transformed boys and girls, now healthy, now clothed, now useful. No one printed the picture of the girl who sat alone in a laundry cell, or the boy who ran away into the bush and was brought back bleeding and silent, or the one who stopped speaking altogether. As the decades passed, the system expanded. More homes, more placements, some more children marked for shipment. It was seen as a solution. Britain rid itself of excess children. Australia gained future workers. And both nations congratulated themselves on the arrangement. But among the rows of sunburnt children in those dusty courtyards, very few felt saved. And as they wiped sweat from their brows or knelt on chapel floors, a question began to root itself. Deep inside, many of them quiet, painful, and unanswered. If this is kindness, what would cruelty have looked like? Asterisk by the 1950s. The machinery of child migration to Australia had slowed, but it had not stopped. The Second World War had altered everything. Families were fractured, cities bombed, and national priorities shifted. Yet amid the reconstruction, British and Australian officials still quietly agreed that sending poor or institutionalized children overseas was a net positive. Fewer mouths to feed in Britain, more hands to work in Australia. And so they continued. The children arrived not in crowds, but in smaller groups. No longer called orphans, as often now they were wards, migrants, or simply boys and girls under care. It was a semantic shift, not a moral one, but the pattern remained. Uniforms, assignments, institutions. Some homes improved. There were a few new policies, a bit more oversight. The worst physical punishments were discouraged, though not eliminated. But the core model children separated from their roots and repurposed for Empire stayed the same at Bindoon and similar institutions. Boys in their teens continued to labor on construction projects, often building dormitories for the next generation of arrivals. Their names were carved only in roll books, not in stone. The concrete walls they mixed would last longer than their childhoods. For many girls, the expectations never changed. To serve, to clean, to accept discipline without question. There were no talks of careers, no university pamphlets, no paths out, only whispers of escape from older girls who had aged out and vanished into the city. Some children grew old inside those places, and when they turned 18, the system released them not with support or ceremony, but with silence. A train ticket, a name, a town, a job, and nothing else. No tracing of their biological families, no reunification efforts, no apology. They entered the world not as young adults, but as unrooted survivors, tethered to anything except what they had learned to endure. The decades that followed saw most of these former migrants blend into obscurity. They became janitors, gardeners, nurses, truck drivers. Some married, some raised families, others lived alone, unwilling or unable to explain where they had come from or why certain silences still followed them into sleep. But inside, many of them carried questions too old to answer. Who were my parents? Did anyone love me? Why was I sent away? And who made that decision for me? It wasn't until the 1990s that the first cracks began to form in the public's forgetfulness. Former child migrants, now in their 60s and 70s, began telling their stories. Not in Parliament, not in books, but in community halls, church basements, and support group circles. Their voices shook, hands trembled. Their memories were clear. They remembered the beatings, The loneliness, the rooms with no windows, the silence when they cried. Australia began to listen, and then Britain followed in 1997. The Australian Senate held an inquiry into child migration and institutional abuse. The stories that emerged were painful and consistent. Some had been physically abused. Others had been sexually exploited. Nearly all had been emotionally abandoned. In 2009, the Australian Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, formally apologized on behalf of the nation. We are sorry for the tragedy, the absolute tragedy of childhoods lost. The British government issued its own apology in 2010. Prime Minister Gordon Brown spoke to the House of Commons. We are truly sorry that they were allowed to be sent away at the time. We express our deep regret. But apologies, though powerful, cannot rewrite the past. They cannot replace the birthdays forgotten. The letters never answered, the names that were never learned, and for those still living, some never told their families, even after the apologies, even after the stories went public. Many former child migrants chose silence, because how do you explain that your childhood was an administrative decision, that your life path was drawn up on a form by someone who never knew your face? Today, there are memorials, stone statues, plaques in gardens, archives filled with scanned documents that once sat yellowing in drawers. But the children themselves are fading. The youngest of them are in their 70s now, and yet the echo of their journey barefoot on unfamiliar soil, labeled and exported like livestock remains. A reminder of what can happen when systems value outcomes over lives. They were promised sunshine and hope. They were given dust and discipline, and still some survived with dignity. They taught themselves how to laugh again. They carved out lives with shaky hands and stubborn hearts. They forgave but never apologized properly. And in the silence, they remembered each other, because no one else had. Asterisk, in the quiet of a stone church in East London, the clergyman's pen scratched methodically across a ledger. The room smelled faintly of soot and damp paper. A window cracked open toward Whitechapel, let in the morning fog, along with the distant clatter of hooves on cobblestones. It was 1892. Outside, the streets were crowded with smoke, hunger, and barefoot children. Inside, the clergyman adjusted his cuffs, dipped his pen again, and continued writing. Name, age, remarks. He was not a cruel man, nor particularly heartless. He believed deeply in Christian charity. But his books were full of names, and his donations were drying up. The streets offered more orphans than he had room for, more mouths than bread, keened and in the brass-bound logic of the Victorian mind. There was a solution waiting. Send them away. This is how faith and finance wove themselves into the engine of Britain's child migration. From the mid-19th century onward, religious institutions across the United Kingdom became central players in the movement of children across oceans, not because they were malevolent, but because they were overburdened, underfunded, and convinced that immigration offered moral and practical salvation. Churches, missions, and religious charities ran homes in London, Glasgow, Liverpool, and Manchester, places that fed, clothed, and educated children left behind by poverty, disease, or parental death. But by the 1860s, these institutions faced overcrowding, criticism, and the constant fear of what to do with the children who stayed too long. Enter the empire, and with it, a promise the colonies needed people, workers, farmers, domestic help, youth, and children needed homes. It sounded simple, noble, even. Religious leaders began organizing immigration parties. Church-run newspapers described them with phrases like a gift to the colonies or God's little gardeners, COD. The idea was not just to relieve the burden on British society, but to spread Christian values by sending British children as living missionaries, moral seed planted in foreign soil. It began with applications. Clergymen filled them out after Sunday service. One boy was quiet but sturdy. Another girl was obedient and trainable. No one asked the child what they thought, but a signature went down. The box was ticked. A life was set in motion. Funding came from tithes, from estate donations, and from mission societies that saw child migration as a spiritual duty. Wealthy patrons contributed too. A few coins in the collection plate on Sunday morning might, in theory, help ship a child. Across the world, most of the children did not know the cost of their own fare. Most did not even know they were leaving until days before the journey began. They were told it was God's will, that they had been chosen for something greater, that their suffering in Britain was being traded for fresh air, hard work, and moral uplift. But the truth was more transactional. Church-run homes had ledgers to balance. Child was an expense, and shipping them overseas, especially when supported by colonial governments eager for settlers, reduced that cost. In some cases, the receiving countries even paid per head, and so the churches, with all their stained glass and solemn hymns, became pipelines. The Sisters of Mercy, the Church of England, Waifs and Strays Society, the Salvation Army, the Catholic Immigration Association. Each participated in the movement of children across the seas, often with paperwork so sparse it could fit on a single card. Name, approximate age, destination, condition, fit for travel. Those who did not meet the requirements were left behind, too frail, too sick, too disobedient. They stayed in the institutions until adulthood, until they vanished into the underbelly of the city. But those deemed eligible were given new shoes, trunk, and a goodbye. Some were paraded through the congregation before departure, dressed in clean uniforms and told to smile. The congregation clapped. Prayers were said, and then the children boarded trains toward the coast, and from there, ships, from pulpit to port in just a few days. Some clergymen followed the children's journeys through letters or reports. Others never did. The work was done. The budget line item erased. A few truly believed they were saving souls, that the pain of separation, the cold distance of empire, would all be redeemed by sunlight, wheat fields, and the discipline of Christian toil. But redemption is not guaranteed, especially when it is imposed. The children shipped to farms, missions, and orphanages in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and beyond often found themselves in systems where religious ideology replaced care, where daily life was an extension of the sermon, and punishment was framed as moral correction. Some were taught to read scripture, but not write their own names. Some learned the 10 Commandments by rote, but were beaten for asking where their parents were. And in every one of these places, the church kept records, not always complete, but always with the same structure: name, date, status, destination. The soul, it seems, could be itemized. And when, years later, some of these former child migrants returned to tell, curious, uncertain, they discovered that the same ledgers still sat in the basements of churches or mission offices, that their names, in careful Victorian ink, were still there, faded but present. It is strange to see your childhood reduced to a line in someone else's book, and stranger still to wonder if the person who wrote it ever knew what it meant. Asterisk in a parish office near Leeds, the Reverend William Forster sat behind a desk stained with years of candle wax and prayer. It was 1905, and he was reviewing letters not from parishioners, but from farmers in Ontario. The letters were formulaic. Some were requests. Others were complaints. Coy, too small for the dairy. Girl, fine at mending, but not strong in winter. Please send another by summer's end. Forster read each note without visible emotion, his spectacles slipping slightly down his nose. He marked the margins with small check marks, then filed them away in a drawer labeled placements. To him, this was a duty one tethered to God's work. He had spent the past decade overseeing the immigration of poor children from his region to the colonies. He prayed over their names, wrote sermons about their salvation, and now he answered correspondence as if they were borrowed tools being reviewed. This scene, mundane, bureaucratic, laced with righteousness, was mirrored in mission offices across Britain. Child migration had become not just a social policy or a charitable initiative, but a moral machine, driven by doctrine, maintained by letters, and fueled by the belief that poverty was a failure of environment, not of character. If you remove the child from the slums, the logic went, you saved the soul. The London-based Waifs and Stray Society printed fundraising appeals that read like parables. A lad once lost to the alleys of Shoreditch, now a proud tiller of the Canadian soil, all thanks to your generous support. These stories were true in parts, perhaps, but the polished prose erased the complexity. What was not included in these appeals were the complaints from children, the ones who sent letters back that were never answered, the ones who asked to come home, the ones who couldn't write at all because they'd never been taught how. Church-run organizations often controlled communication between children and their families. If a parent in Britain attempted to write to a child in Australia, the letter might be intercepted, screened for content, or simply not forwarded if the receiving institution deemed it emotionally disruptive. Similarly, if a child wrote home expressing sadness, loneliness, or discontent, the mission staff might quietly rewrite et tu, advise the child to try again with a more grateful tone. The doctrine of moral uplift had little room for emotional truth. Even well-meaning clergy fell into this pattern. A child who cried was not yet adjusted. A child who refused chores was stubborn or unconverted. The theological lens through which these children were viewed made it difficult for anyone in authority to ask the most basic questions. Is this child safe? Is this child happy? Does this child want to be here? Instead, church newsletters printed verses, mission, reports, tracked how many psalms had been memorized, and in the margins of the old ledgers, you might find brief notes like, Alice 14, placed in Queensland, prefers sewing to scripture. Robert Wolf-Solon, reassigned, possibly melancholic. Faith had, in many cases, become a filter one that obscured suffering behind a fog of spiritual intention. The idea that God's will could be manifested through obedience shaped everything. If a child was quiet and diligent, they were blessed. They acted out, it was a sign of sin or need for discipline. But what if it was just homesickness? What if it was trauma? What if the child was simply a child? This framing stretched across the empire, in New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, anywhere British missions operated, there were children placed not into homes, but into theological structures. The institution became both guardian and priest. The children were told they were chosen, even as their choices were removed in later years. Survivors would reflect on this contradiction. Some remembered kind clergy. Others remembered fear. Some said the Bible was their only comfort. Tenna said it became a symbol of silence. A few, now elderly, would flip through their old prayer books and find faded notations made in pencil, hurriedly, as if trying to claim ownership of something in a life that had been largely dictated by others. Still, it would be unfair to cast every clergyman or nun as callous. Many genuinely believed they were doing the Lord's work, but belief, however sincere, cannot excuse systemic indifference, and it was systemic by the 1930s. The Church of England alone had helped send thousands of children overseas. The Catholic Church managed similar numbers. And nearly all of it was documented in the neat, spare language of administrative faith. The ledgers kept track, but the ledgers did not listen. And as the children grew older, scattered across farmlands, convents, and city outskirts, they began to understand something that had never been said aloud. They had not been saved. They had been managed. In Mission records, there is often a final note written as a child ages out, a sentence like, "No further supervision required," as if the child simply stopped needing guidance or ceased to be the church's concern. But what happened to them afterward? That is where the records go silent, and where history, finally, must begin to listen. Asterisk, by the end of the 1960s, the great moral project of shipping children across oceans in the name of salvation was drawing to a close, not with confession, not with ceremony, but with fatigue. The governments of Britain and its former colonies were rethinking their post-war roles. Air travel had made migration more complex. Domestic child welfare systems were slowly modernizing, and the faith-based institutions that had once overseen entire populations of orphans were shrinking in influence. Their authority questioned more openly with each passing year, but the children were still there. Now, adults, many were working quietly as postmen, shopkeepers, truck drivers, nurses. Some had married and started families. Others remained alone, living in boarding houses, their past locked behind unspoken walls. Few spoke of their origins. Even fewer had the records to explain them. Inside the dusty archives of mission homes, church offices, and state-run facilities, boxes of files lay untouched. Ledgers written in blue-black ink listed names with ticks and crosses. These were not rich documents, just fragments. But for those searching for identity, even a single line could be enough. Harold age 10 immigrated, 1927 placed, Tasmania. Maggie age 13 deemed suitable for domestic service sent to NSW. The paper yellowed, the ink faded, but the loss remained sharp. Asterisk. In the 1980s, a man named Bernard born in a London workhouse and sent to Australia in 1939 walked into a diocesan archive in hopes of finding his records. He had lived in 3 different institutions, had worked on 6 farms, and had never known his real birthday. He'd carried the same small photograph of a woman he believed might be his mother for 50 years. The archivist found a card, a terrace, 1 card, with his name, in 1 sentence. Child rehomed. No further information. A terra was all Bernard later said he cried for the first time in 30 years. Not because he was sad, but because someone had finally acknowledged he existed. Stories like his emerged slowly, unevenly, as elderly former migrants began asking questions no one had encouraged them to ask in their youth. Who decided this for me? Was my mother still alive when I was sent? Did anyone in the church ever think I might want to stay? In Britain, Australia, and Canada, these questions led to inquiries, and those inquiries led to apologies. But apologies are not keys, Don't unlock childhoods. They don't give back birthdays. Still, they are better than silence. The Church of England issued statements of regret. So did Catholic orders. Some institutions released archives to survivors. Others resisted. But slowly, painfully, a record began to form not of salvation, but of systemized forgetting. And at the center of it all were the ledgers. Dozens of them, hundreds, neatly bound, often stored in basements or back offices. Each line a child. Each child a person. Each person once told that God had a plan. But the ledgers don't say if the plan was ever explained. They don't say if the child cried when told they were leaving. They don't say if the boat ride was frightening. They don't say whether the boy who preferred sewing to scripture ever got to sew again. They don't say whether Maggie in New South Wales has ever found someone to call her by her real name. They only say placed, sent, transferred, removed. Words that reduce lives to logistics. Yet, even in their coldness, the The ledgers speak volumes because they confirm what generations were told to forget. Their lives had been organized by others for reasons that sounded like faith but felt like distance. Today, some of those ledgers have been digitized. Others remain hidden, still, waiting in brittle boxes. Survivors search them like archaeologists, hoping to excavate the childhoods they were never allowed to finish. Some find answers. Some find only silence. But perhaps the most tragic truth is this: the institutions that recorded so much about these children rarely recorded the one thing that mattered, what they wanted. And so, the story of faith-funded migration ends not with a judgment, but with a question. Not, was it moral? Not, was it legal? But simply, what does it say about a society when its mercy is written in ledgers, but its love is nowhere to be found? Asterisk. It was not the cruelty that defined the days. Not always. It was the monotony, the bell that rang at 5:30 a.m. sharp, the thin porridge ladled into cold metal bowls, the long rows of children marching toward fields before the sun had finished rising, and above all, the constant ache and the belly hunger that never quite went away, but dulled just enough to let the day continue. This was life at the farm schools, spread across Canada, Australia, and parts of South Africa. These institutions were meant to shape children, mostly British, often orphaned or abandoned to future laborers for the empire. The name farm school implied education, cultivation, progress, but for those who lived there, the name rarely matched the experience. They were not students in any traditional sense. They were workers. They were hungry. In Western Australia, places like Fairbridge Farm School promise a new life in the sunshine for British children of the slums. From the streets to the soil, the brochures declared. But what they received was a strict regime of physical labor, spiritual correction, and minimal food. Boys were taught to plow, dig, chop, and build. Girls were assigned to domestic work, washing sheets, ironing shirts, scrubbing tiled floors until their hands cracked from the bleach. Schooling happened, but only after chores, and always with an eye toward usefulness. They memorized hymns faster than they learned math. They learned to sort seeds before they learned their own. Birthdays, and while the empire called it character building, the children themselves often called it hunger. Meals were regimented and sparse. Breakfast might be porridge watery, unseasoned, served without sugar. Lunch could be dry bread with margarine and, once or twice a week, a boiled egg or a slice of cheese. Dinner might bring stew, but it was more water than meat. If there were vegetables, they were overcooked and soft. There was rarely fruit. A sandwich was a treat, a second helping. Almost mythical. Children learned quickly that food was not just nourishment, it was currency. A crust of bread traded for a favor. A leftover potato pocketed under a shirt and saved for later. Some were punished for stealing what they considered survival. The staff didn't see the children as starving or cue it. The rations met the required quotas. And there was a belief rooted deep in Victorian morality that hunger was part of discipline. To be too full was to grow lazy. To want more was to invite sin. But there was a different kind of starvation happening too, of comfort, of affection, of freedom. Most children at farm schools had no family nearby. Their guardians were the staff, usually overworked, sometimes kind, sometimes not. Some homes were run by clergymen who believed firmly in punishment and prayer. Others by matrons who saw emotion as weakness. Hugs were rare, kind words rarer. Still, at night, the dormitories echoed with coughs and whispered questions. Do you think my mom's still alive? What's London like now? Did you eat a slug for a piece of cake? Some of them laughed, but it was the dry kind. The kind that comes when you're trying to forget your stomach. Feels like a rock. Sleep was a fragile thing. The beds were hard. The rooms drafty. Winter brought shivering beneath thin blankets. Summer brought insects, bites, and the sharp scent of sweat. The children learned to wake quickly. Being late for morning duties was a punishable offense, and any attempt to sneak food from the kitchen carried risks. Punishments varied. A missed chore might result in extra labor. Talking back meant isolation. Taking an extra roll from the pantry if caught could mean caning. But most punishments weren't physical. They were in the routines. The unyielding schedules, the absence of praise. Every task had a standard. Every child had a number. And every moment was a reminder that they were not here to dream. They were here to be shaped. Boys who broke tools were reprimanded, not for the accident, but for wasting the colony's resources. Girls who broke down in tears were told to grow up. No one asked why they were crying, and yet, among the strictness and the hunger, there were slivers of humanity. A boy might help another finish a chore. A girl might sneak an apple to a friend with fewer rations. An older child might whisper a bedtime story made up on the spot. These were the unrecorded kindnesses, the invisible acts of resistance against a world that had given them so little. Softness. Visitors, when they came, saw tidy uniforms and well-rehearsed manners. A few even praised the schools, noting how disciplined the children appeared. Photos were taken of smiling faces, holding spades or baskets of vegetables. No one asked how many children cried themselves to sleep that week, and yet, the institutions continued to find over decades, funded by donations, blessed by church leaders, supported by empire. The children remained, digging, learning, surviving, always just a little bit hungry, always wondering if things might change, and perhaps most quietly of all, always wondering if we were meant to be the future of the empire. Why did it feed us like we didn't matter? Asterisks. The clock never ticked. Not that the children could hear. Anyway, in most farm schools, the days ran on bell-sharp, metallic, and absolute. A bell for waking, a bell for chores, a bell for meals, a bell for chapel, and then, if there was time left, a bell for school. But education was never the centerpiece. At institutions like Fairbridge in Australia or Marchmont in Canada, a promise of education was used more as a selling point for donors than a consistent reality for the children themselves. Lessons, when they happened, were short, often improvised, sometimes supervised by instructors with little training and even less patience. Asterisk history came in fragments, dates, kings, and empire glories. Math rarely went beyond long division. Science was nearly non-existent. Literature, if taught, was religious. Bible passages, moral poems, memorized without context. Writing was essential only for copying instructions and filling in forms. Many children left farm schools unable to read fluently. Some never learned to write their full name in cursive. The purpose was not to educate, it was to prepare. Prepared the boys for a life of hard work. Prepared the girls for domestic service. Prepare all of them to obey, endure, and never question authority. One boy was placed at a farm school outside New South Wales in the 1940s. Later remembered being told, "You'll be lucky if you ever see a real school. You're here to learn how to survive, not how to dream." Survival meant rising early and working through pain. It meant enduring the blisters, ignoring the hunger, smiling for visitors, and learning how to use silence as a form of self-protection. And yet, despite this relentless environment, the children found ways to create slivers of humanity. In between chores and drills, they shared what little they had. A torn magazine passed from hand to hand. A drawing scratched into the dirt behind the shed. Song hummed beneath breath while folding laundry. A few lines of chalk graffiti on a barn walk really washed away, but not forgotten. Older children became guardians to the younger ones. They whispered advice, how to avoid certain staff, which door creaked the least, how to sneak a piece of potato without being caught, and always, They watched the clock even when no actual clock could be seen. Time passed differently here. Hours stretched out like the fences they were forced to mend. Weeks blurred into seasons. And birthdays came and went with no cards, no cake, and often not even a mention. Sometimes a supervisor would pause and ask, "How old are you now?" But the children didn't always know. Records were wrong. Birthdays were estimated. Some had been registered under different names upon arrival, depending on which clerk filled out the form. And so a child might turn 10 or 12 or 14, and no one could say for sure. In a place where time was marked only by labor, age became a detail, not a celebration. On Sundays, chapel offered a brief reprieve, not because the children found comfort in sermons, but because it meant one less hour in the fields. They sang hymns with tired voices, okay? They sat on wooden benches, dressed in their best uniforms, washed the night before with care. Okay, they bowed their heads, not always in reverence, but in exhaustion. Some whispered prayers, not for salvation, but for breakfast to come sooner, or for their shoes to last another month, or for the staff to be in a good mood that day. And all the while, the world beyond the gates continued. War broke out, ended. Governments changed. Planes flew overhead. Cities modernized. But inside the farm schools, little changed. The routines stayed the same. The food remained sparse. The learning stayed shallow. Letters, when they came, were often read aloud by staff first. Some children never received any. Others were told their family had stopped writing. Sometimes this was true. Often it wasn't, in a few rare cases. Siblings were sent to the same institution, but placed in different buildings, forbidden from regular contact. Some only realized their brother or sister had been nearby years later, after they had left. When inspectors visited, the staff prepared carefully. Children were coached on what to say. Smiles were rehearsed. Complaints discouraged. Tell them you're happy, they were told. And so most did, because they understood that truth was not rewarded. Here, gratitude was to question, was to risk punishment, was to confess unhappiness, was to be labeled difficult. And so they played the part, hardworking, malleable, obedient. But in the dormitories, as the sky darkened and the fields fell silent, they whispered other truths about the aches in their legs, about the taste of dust in their mouths, about the dream where someone came back for them. Some held on to names of mothers, siblings, a street they could barely remember. Others let those details fade. It was easier that way, and all the while, the bells kept ringing, marking time, placing birthdays, announcing labor, until one day the bell would ring and they would not come, because they had aged out, because they had left, because the system had finished with them. And yet, as they walked through the gates for the final time, now taller, wearier, more silent, they carried no certificate, no diploma, no moment of farewell, only a worn coat, a name that might not be theirs, and a hunger that had nothing to do with food. Asterisk, there was no graduation ceremony, no framed certificate, no farewell party. When the children at the farm schools turned 16 nor, in some cases, 18, they simply left. Not always with warning, sometimes with a note from the headmaster, times with nothing more than a brief word at breakfast. You're old enough now, you'll be moving on tomorrow. Hey, that was that. Some were sent to work on nearby farms as hired hands. Others were placed into domestic service with rural families. A few drifted toward the cities, unfamiliar with currency, unsure how to navigate public transport, illiterate or barely literate, and frightened to speak. Most had never handled money before. Some had never seen a post office. What they carried with them was not an education, but a set of habits, how to obey without flinching, how to make a meal out of almost nothing, how to keep your head down even when the world should be looking you in the eye. There were no archives documenting those departures in detail, no photographs of smiling faces at the gate. The farm schools kept records of arrivals, of chores completed, tage of infractions, but exits were administrative, not emotional. Left institution, assigned to Mr. J. Weaver, Goulburn District, discharged, domestic employment, Perth, no further contact. Those who aged out without placement were sometimes returned to government welfare agencies or to shelters for the indigent. Others simply vanished into the geography of the continent, their names lost in the folds of time and bureaucracy. And yet, the memory of the place the farm school never left them. For many former residents, the smell of overcooked porridge could summon whole seasons of their youth. The ring of a distant bell could send a shiver through the back. The shape of a boot print in dry soil could feel like a visitation from a former life. They remembered, even when no one else did. Some, now elderly, still spoke of food, not just in terms of hunger, but of meaning, the way a single sandwich soft bread, a smear of jam had once seemed like wealth. Taste of real butter, the rarity of a sweet. One woman, raised in a Fairbridge home in New South Wales, later told a social worker, "The first time I ever had cake, I was 23. I cried, not because of the taste, but because I realized I'd lived a whole childhood without ever being allowed to celebrate." And that was the real weight of the farm schools, not just the labor, the isolation, or the worn-out hands, but the quiet denial of celebration, of childhood itself. There were no birthday candles, no favorite meals, no stories read aloud under warm blankets. Even the concept of choice what to eat, what to wear, what to say was so foreign that many children lost the ability to think of their lives as belonging to them. They had been managed, not raised, fed, but not nourished, taught tasks, but not dreams. In the decades that followed, these survivors re-entered the world in every imaginable way. Some built strong lives, families, careers, routines of their own making. Others struggled with trust, with shame, the invisible scars of routine deprivation. Many did not speak of their upbringing until much later. It was often there, children curious about family history, who would finally ask, "Where did you grow up?" And the answer would come slowly. "A place with fields. We worked a lot. Food was ... not much." And then, perhaps, a longer pause. "I don't really remember being a kid." In time, official inquiries into the history of child migration and institutional care unearthed more than statistics. They uncovered stories, patterns, losses that had once been described in ledgers, but now echoed in human voices. Some farm schools were turned into museums or historical sites. Others were left to decay, their windows broken, their yards overgrown. A few plaques were mounted, quiet acknowledgments. Too late, perhaps, for many of the children who had once knelt in those dirt fields with scraped knees and empty stomachs. But those who lived still remembered, and in their memories, certain details remained unshakable. The day a visitor left behind half a sandwich. The time someone shared a stolen spoon of condensed milk. The rare moment a matron handed out apples and no one asked why, because in a life governed by scarcity, small gestures became whole memories. And the final question, it's the one that lingers long after the school bells have rusted, is not about blame or justice or systems. It is simpler. Why was it so hard for us to let them feel full just once? Asterisk, it was the wind that startled her most, not the sea voyage, though it had been long and churning. Not the smell of sickness below deck, or the barks of the overseers, or the way the ship tilted at night like it might slip off the edge of the world. But the wind in England, the air had been wet, even in winter. Rain had a sound like tapping on glass or boots sloshing through puddles. But this wind in Western Australia cut across the plains like it was trying to erase the land itself. It didn't just whistle, it screamed. It pushed through the cracks of every wooden wall and carried dust into the corners of everything. And when it swept past the newly arrived children, it did not spare them. The girl, 9 years old, alone, did not cry. Not when she boarded the ship in Liverpool. Not when she was made to wear a too big coat with a missing button. Not when she was separated from the boy she'd sat beside in the orphanage for 2 years. Even when they arrived and someone took her name down incorrectly. Emily, Kay, the woman asked. Pencil ready? No, the girl said, quietly. Asterisk, but the woman nodded as if she'd heard what she wanted to and wrote Emily Carter. Millie didn't correct her. Silence was easier. It cost less, didn't require explaining or repeating or risking punished for speaking at the wrong time. She had learned that long ago from the first matron who didn't believe her, from the second one who wouldn't let her eat until every other child had finished. Asterisk. By the time she stepped off the boat, silence had become her survival. She joined a group of other girls, each one given a canvas satchel and a number pinned to their collar. The satchels had coarse towels, a toothbrush, and a tin cup. Nothing personal, no letters, no photographs, no mementos from the world they'd left behind. That world was already gone at the orphanage in England. The children had been told they were special, that they were being selected, that they were lucky. Not everyone gets a fresh start. One of the wardens had said, with the false brightness of someone delivering bad news as if it were a prize. You're going to Australia, a beautiful place, with sun and farms and kind people who will take care of you. No one mentioned how far away it really was. No one said what would happen when they got there. Millie's group was taken by lorry from the port to a rural institution on the outskirts of Perth. It had been a sheep station once, long ago, then a missionary school. Now it was painted white and had lines of vegetable gardens in front, neat and low. Everything about the place was measured, symmetrical. Even the voices line up, hands behind your back, no speaking at meals. So Millie kept silent. She watched and copied how the older girls folded their uniforms, where to place her shoes at night, how to sleep with a blanket pulled tight to avoid the mosquitoes. She said yes when she needed to, no when it was safe to do so, and otherwise remained still. But silence, it turned out, was not enough. One evening, a matron accused her of stealing a second slice of bread. Millie hadn't. She hadn't even touched the plate, but the girl beside her had. The matron either didn't see clearly or didn't care. You, she snapped, pointing. Emily Carter stepped forward. Millie did. She took the slap without sound, just a blink, just a small intake of breath. The bread was removed. Dinner was finished. No one looked up. Later, as they brushed their teeth with bitter-tasting powder, the girl who'd actually taken the bread whispered, "Sorry." Millie nodded once, but she didn't cry. In this new world, crying was dangerous, could bring attention or derision, or worse, sympathy, which always carried a price. If you cried, someone might ask what was wrong. Hey, if you told them, they might think you were lying, or they might believe you and be unable to help. So Millie didn't risk it at night. Lying on her bunk, she thought of sounds, the ticking of the old clock in the Liverpool orphanage, the soft cough of the boy she'd once called her brother, the rustle of blankets when she used to sleep two to a bed, and her legs were always warm. Now there was only the wind, then the howling across the trees, the scratch of branches, the call of a bird she didn't recognize. All of it strange, all of it loud and still. She said nothing. Weeks turned into months. Her hands grew calloused from scrubbing, her arms stronger from hauling water from the pea. pump her skin browned from the sun. She learned to write her new name, Emily Carter. She learned to sew it into the collar of her shift. Okay. She learned to respond to it without pause. But inside, she remained Millie, somewhere deep and folded. The staff called her a quiet one, which in some ways protected her. She was not known for outbursts, not singled out for mischief. Her chores were done on time, her sheets were smooth, and so she was overlooked. But even silence, when practiced long enough, becomes its own language. She began to notice things others didn't. The matron's mood by the way she walked in the morning, the subtle shift in routine before inspections, the way the cook gave a slightly larger scoop of porridge to girls who smiled first, and eventually she learned how to barter quietly, a mended hem in exchange for a half slice of orange, helping a girl wash her hair in exchange for the use of a second blanket. Nothing grand, nothing risky, just the soft mechanisms of survival. And yet, in all this quiet strength, one question grew more persistent as the seasons passed. How long can you live in a world that never calls you by your real name and still remember who you are? Asterisk, by the time Millie reached her 10th birthday, no one remembered it. Not the staff at the home, not the girls in her dormitory, not even Millie herself. At first, there were no calendars in the children's quarters. The days folded into each other like damp laundry, indistinguishable and vaguely heavy. But on one early morning, still dark, still cold, she was roused by the call of the bell, and, for a moment, she paused. There was no reason to think of it, and yet she did, somewhere deep inside her quiet mind. The memory surfaced. This was the day her mother had taken her for lemon buns. She had been 5 then. They'd sat on a bench outside a bakery in Birkenhead, and Millie had held the sweet in both hands like a treasure. That was the last time she'd had a birthday. Now, 5 years later, she stood at the wash basin and stared at the cracked enamel as the other girls shuffled into line behind her. The air smelled of soap and the soft grease used to tame hair. There were no lemon buns, no benches, just wooden floors and rule books. Still, she allowed herself to think. Today, in 10, that thought alone felt like rebellion, because here, the girls were not meant to have identities beyond their uniforms and assigned duties. They were numbers in a registry, names on ledgers. Their stories had been clipped short, like the uneven haircuts they received once a month from the shears-wielding matron. But something had shifted, slight, like the first edge of spring after a long, dry season. And it started not with words, but with listening. Millie had noticed how the older girls talked when the matrons weren't around. At night, under wool blankets, during latrine breaks, in hurried whispers over peeling potatoes. They told stories, not just of what was, but of what had been. I had a dog, one said, before, in Kent. His name was Baxter. My mom made ginger tea with real sugar, said another. She said it cured everything. Millie said nothing. She listened. She listened when a girl named Irene, 14, and clever with her hands, taught others how to sew hidden pockets into their uniforms, just enough to hide a pebble, a string, a folded leaf. She listened when Hazel, who was barely 13, taught a few of them how to mimic the matron's voice with such accuracy that even the boys in the field turned to obey. These weren't real rebellions, not the kind that made headlines or songs. They were small, boring things, quiet acts, measured defiance. But to the girls, they were everything. They were identity, ownership, memory, and Millie wanted to try. She started by collecting things, tiny things, a piece of red thread from a frayed curtain, a bead that had fallen off a visiting woman's bracelet, scrap of paper from a delivery box. She tucked them inside the hem of her shift, sewing them in carefully with the needle she borrowed from Irene. Each item meant nothing to others, but to her, they became anchors. The red thread, It reminded her of the ribbon her mother used to tie around her ponytail. The bead. It looked like one her brother had once swallowed by accident. The scrap of paper. It had the word Liverpool faintly visible on one edge. She didn't show anyone. She didn't even touch them, lest she needed to, but she knew they were there. They reminded her that before she had been Emily Carter, she had been someone else. Not loud, not bold, but real. The staff remained oblivious. Or perhaps they simply didn't care. The children were always vanishing in some way, some sent to farms, some relocated to homes with new guardians, and some quietly just gone. The girls learned early not to ask where anyone had gone. It was better to stay silent, to adapt, to survive. But survival, Millie began to understand, wasn't just about keeping your head down. It was about choosing what parts of yourself you refused to give away. And then one day, the silence broke it. Happened without warning. The girls had been lined up in the courtyard after breakfast. A routine inspection. Hands clean, boots polished, uniforms pressed. A new administrator had arrived, an official from the government. He was there to ensure conditions were proper. Millie had seen his type before. Clean hat, notepad, okay? No real attention behind the eyes. But as he paced the row, he stopped suddenly in front of her. You? What's your name? She hesitated. The matron stood behind him, arms crossed. Millie glanced at her, then back at the man. Millie, she said. The courtyard went still. The man scribbled something, then moved on. The matron said nothing in that moment. But later that night, Millie was summoned. She stood outside the matron's office, fists clenched inside. The room smelled of wax and old paper. You gave the wrong name, the matron said. I gave my real name, Millie replied. The matron stared. You'll use the one assigned. Remember the other one. Silence. The matron leaned forward. That doesn't matter here. Millie didn't respond. There was nothing more to say. She returned to the dormitory, expecting punishment, but none came. Not that night, not the next day. Instead, something else happened. The other girls started asking questions, soft ones. Millie, is that your real name? She nodded. Double quotes. Do you remember where you're from? Another nod, and slowly like dust sifting through floorboards, something began to change. A girl named Lou whispered that her name used to be Bridget. One called Joy admitted she'd never liked the name she'd been given and still thought of herself as Ruth. It was not a revolution. No one raised their voice. No one escaped. But it was a quiet awakening. Each girl began to remember not just who they had been, but what they had lost. Some wrote names on hidden scraps of cloth. Others carved initials into the underside of bunk slats. They couldn't go home, but they could carry it within them. And Millie, once the silent one, the shadow had shown them how. Still, she wondered, if the world has decided to forget who you were, how long before you forget too? Asterisk, the year Millie was shipped away. The paperwork listed her as Emily Carter, age 11, eligible for overseas placement. There were no details about the red thread, the bead, or the paper scrap sewn into her hem. No mention of the fact that her real name wasn't Emily, or that she'd once loved lemon buns, or that her mother had been kind but broke. The record didn't ask what her brother's name had been, or whether he'd been taken to a different home, or even whether he'd survived. That kind of paperwork had no lines for humanity. She stood now on the deck of a ship, an actual ship with a stiff collar buttoned up to her chin, holding a canvas satchel with Carter stamped in thick black ink. The sea was gray. The sky was the same dot. Somewhere behind her, England. Somewhere ahead, Australia or Canada or South Africa, depended on the list. And lists changed. They were told to keep their satchels with them and not to speak unless spoken to. There were rules for how to descend stairs, how to use the toilet, how to respond to authority, or even rules for standing on deck. Millie followed them all, but inside she kept a different set of rules, unspoken ones. Never give away your real name unless someone earns it. Hide something personal in every new place you live. Watch who cries and who doesn't. Those who don't might know something important. Always listen to the silences more than the words. They were rules for survival, but also for memory. Millie wasn't the only girl sent across oceans. In the years between 1869 and 1970, over 100,000 British children were exported under various child migration schemes. Some were told their parents had died when they hadn't. Others were pulled from homes with no explanation. Many were placed in rural orphanages or work farms overseas, treated as laborers more than children, and the reasons for their relocation were, by design, boring. The British government, struggling with poverty and overcrowded institutions, saw these children as surplus. Shipping them overseas would ease the burden and supposedly give them a better life. Some officials even referred to them in logistical terms: cargo, allotments, quotas. The phrase child migration concealed a colder truth. These were unwanted minors, removed like clutter. The records speak with clinical detachment. Tony 7. Boys dispatched to Fremantle under escort. 4 girls to Adelaide. 3 children ill, left behind. And Millie. She was one of the thousands whose name was changed, relabeled, absorbed into these ledgers. Her first months in Australia were numbingly repetitive. The new dormitory was identical to the one in England. Same iron beds, same gray blankets, same scent of disinfectant. The adults spoke with unfamiliar accents, but the rules were the same. Don't ask questions. Work hard. Be thankful. The meals were thin. The days were hot. And the nights were long stretches of dry coughing and whispered prayers. But something curious happened in the absence of family. The girls began to mother each other. It was never spoken. There was no permission granted. But as they scrubbed floors and carried firewood, as they stitched uniforms and prepared bread, a quiet sisterhood formed. Millie, now 12, shared her hidden treasures one by one. She gave Irene, who had ended up in the same home after all, the red thread, tying it around her wrist, to Ruth, formerly Joy. She passed the bead, tucked inside a fold of cloth, and to a girl named Beatrice. I had never remembered anything before the ship. She offered the paper scrap. It's from a box, Millie said, from Liverpool. Beatrice stared at it as if it were a photograph. Is that where we came from? Maybe, Millie whispered. Maybe not. They began making their own records, not on official forms, but on cloth, bits of wood, chalk on stones. They wrote names, real names. They made an inventory of memory. Sarah, who remembered lemon trees. May, who had once seen snow. Lou, whose mother had called her little button. Names without birth certificates. Memories without documentation. But they were real. The local officials never noticed, or pretended not to, and still, the routine continued. More children arrived. Others disappeared. Some were sent to farms where they worked in isolation for years. Some ran away, and some, too many, simply faded into the system. Millie stayed. She grew taller, learned to cook, learned to read, taught others how to write their names. By the time she was 16, she was made a supervisor, an older girl with keys. And when new girls arrived, frightened, blank-eyed, Millie gave them what no official ever had: a history. Where are you from? She would ask softly. Some didn't know. Others gave names they barely remembered. Millie would not. It's all right. You'll remember more later. And if they didn't, it was still all right, because even a name remembered by someone else was enough. Years later, Millie left the home and worked in a small town as a seamstress. She never married, never returned to England, but in her dresser drawer there was a box. Inside were small, dull objects: a pressed flower, a red thread, a button, a folded note with the word Birkenhead scrawled in fading ink. None of it was worth anything, and yet it was everything. Her full name was never restored in any official file. The government never apologized in her lifetime. Her story was never included in textbooks, but one night, an old friend from the home Beatrice visited. They sat by a stove, shared tea, and looked through the old box. "I kept mine too," Beatrice said. "Still have the paper." They didn't speak much after that. They didn't need to. In the quiet, they remembered everything. And yet, Millie sometimes wondered how many others never had a red thread, or a Beatrice, or a single moment to remember who they were. Asterisk, in 1928, a boy named Thomas Layton disappeared from London. He wasn't kidnapped. He wasn't lost. He wasn't missing in the way the newspapers meant when they printed that word, cat. His name was recorded, quite properly crossed off. One list added to another, then forwarded to a distant institution via rail and CDOT. There was no search for him, because no one expected him to stay. Thomas Layton was 10 years old. He had green eyes, a habit of chewing his knuckles when nervous, and a stammer that made teachers impatient. His mother had died when he was 6. His father was unavailable, a word used when the staff at the parish workhouse couldn't find a man or didn't want to look too hard. He lived in the Woolwich Union Industrial School for poor children, where discipline was strict and warmth a rare currency. Thomas didn't misbehave. He didn't stand out. He was a quiet child, thin, awkward, calm, and often found asleep in odd places, behind coal bins, beneath staircases, key in the hayloft, if no one noticed. The matron called him that sleepy one. There were more urgent children to attend to: fighters, runaways, girls who refused to sew. Thomas faded into the background like an extra chair or a loose floorboard. One rainy Thursday, he was summoned to the headmaster's office. He was told to pack no explanation. Pack. When he asked where he was going, the answer was, away. By Friday, he was dressed in a wool suit 2 sizes too big, seated with other boys at the Liverpool docks. The satchel held a comb too, pennies, and a sealed envelope labeled to Thomas from Mom. It had been handed to him when he first arrived at the school years ago. He was told to open it when you're old enough. He never had. The envelope was slightly yellowed now. The ink had bled a little at the corners, and still, he didn't open it. On the ship to Canada, Thomas slept through most of the voyage. He curled up near vents, under benches, sometimes on the floor between bunks. He slept to avoid talking, to stay invisible. The escort officer thought he was sick and noted his lethargy in the report. But no doctor was called. No fever recorded. One line in the ship's ledger simply read, Thomas L., age 10, sleeps excessively, eats little, quiet disposition. He arrived in Halifax in mid-October. It was already cold. Frost bit at his cuffs as he stood on the dock, waiting for his name to be called. Each child was assigned, sorted. St. Thomas was placed with a farming family in Manitoba, several hundred miles inland. His placement record included a brief line, expected to assist with livestock. Quiet, no reported illnesses. The family who received him, the Devereaux, were not cruel, but they were not kind either. They needed hands, not conversation. The boy worked with the pigs, shoveled feed, helped with the water pump, and kept mostly to himself. When he asked to attend school, the answer was, work first, maybe in spring. Spring never came in that sense. By then, Thomas had already lost the envelope. He thought it might have fallen from his satchel in the hay barn, or been taken by the wind. He searched for it for days in silence. When he couldn't find it, he stopped talking altogether. The Devereaux assumed he was slow, but Thomas wasn't slow. He simply didn't trust the world with his voice anymore. And besides, no one had ever read the letter to him in his mind. The letter still existed, whole, safe, intact. Somewhere, he invented its contents in his dreams. Maybe it said he had an aunt in Wales who loved strawberries. Maybe it explained that his real name wasn't Thomas. Maybe it told a story, or had a drawing, or maybe it said, simply, I loved you. I tried. He would never know, and that was the part he could not say out loud. One Sunday, he met another, boy Matthew, from a neighboring farm. They exchanged nods while their host spoke about feed prices. Matthew said, Do you remember England? Thomas nodded. Double quotes. Did they tell you where your parents went? No, Thomas whispered. Me neither. Matthew paused. I got a letter too. But mine was empty. Just a folded piece of paper, okay? They both stared at the ground for a while. Then Matthew said, Want to come tomorrow? It's a tree down the road with red leaves. Looks like fire. Thomas didn't answer. The next day, he went. They didn't talk about the letters again, but Thomas began writing new ones. In his head, to no one. Dear Mom, he'd begin, then pause, then start again. Dear, whoever finds this, I'm still here. The wind blew through the prairie that winter. Snow came early. The work was heavy, but in the moments before, sleep curled under thin blankets. Thomas recited those silent letters to himself, each one ending with a question. If I ever go home, would you still recognize me? Asterisk, by the winter of 1929. Thomas Layton had spent more nights under Manitoba skies than under London's. The land was wide and wordless. The snow flattened sound, the prairie wind, wildways whispering, always prowling erased footprints by dawn. To survive, it was not to master it, but to disappear into its schedule. Feed, chop, shovel, mend, sleep, repeat, no. One at the Devereux farm asked Thomas many questions. He was useful, polite, too quiet. That was all. They called him Tommy. That name stuck. No one remembered his surname. He wasn't asked to spell it. His file, sent by the Canadian branch of the British Immigration Society, was misplaced. Sometime in the spring floods, it had noted his name, age, transport date, and the name of the farm family. No copy remained with Thomas. There were no photographs, no proof he existed before Halifax. To some, this was convenience. To others, it was FORGETFULNESS. To Thomas, it was vanishing, once, while hauling water for the pigs. He asked Mrs. Devereux, what happens if someone forgets your name? She blinked. Well, someone else just gives you a new one, I suppose. He said nothing more. That winter, Thomas grew taller. His boots cracked, sleeves shortened. He began to understand that speaking wasn't the same as being heard, and being remembered wasn't the same as being known. Still, he was careful. When he found a scrap of paper, usually the corner of a feed invoice or sugar sack label, he wrote fragments of letters. He had no pen. He used sharp from the stove. Sometimes a dull pencil stub that was too short for Mrs. Devereux to hold properly. He'd write under the eaves, where the light fell softly in the late afternoon. Dear Ma'am, today I helped a cow give birth. It was strange. The calf didn't want to breathe at first. I whispered to it. It lived. Dear someone. Do people in England still wear hats on Sundays? Dear me. If you forget your own birthday, do you disappear? He never mailed them. He had no address to send them to, and by 1930, he had no idea what year he was born. He asked Matthew once, his friend from the next farm over, how old do you think we are? Matthew shrugged, old enough to shovel and young enough to not be paid. They both laughed softly. It was a rare sound. The winters stretched, then bled into dusty springs. By the age of 12 or 13, though, Thomas never could confirm, which he began to feel something shift. The Devereux no longer referred to him as a boy. He was Tom now. He worked alone. He mended fences, stacked hay, and even drove the wagon into town with Mr. Devereaux when necessary. He stopped asking to go to school. No one had said no, but no one said yes either. In a rare moment of bravery, he once asked the town librarian if he could borrow a book. The woman, startled, asked, "Are you one of the English ones?" He nodded. "Name?" He hesitated. "Tom Layton." He said Dodge. She scanned a sheet with a list of permitted names. Keys wasn't there. "You'll have to bring someone to sign for you." He didn't go back. Instead, he taught himself to read from a discarded seed catalog and a worn King James Bible in the Devereaux parlor. The older daughter, Marjorie, once caught him mouthing the words. "Why are you always reading that?" she asked. "I'm not reading it for the stories," he said. "Then what for?" "I just like hearing English out loud," he said. "It's a kind from home." She had nothing to say to that. The following winter, the barn roof collapsed during a storm. Thomas was inside, tying up sacks of grain. The Devereaux found him hours later, barely conscious. His leg was broken. For weeks, he lay on a makeshift cat near the kitchen, smelling potatoes and turpentine and smoke. He slept often, just like when he was younger, and in those half-lucid hours, he dreamed of the envelope he lost. Sometimes he found it tucked into the roots of a prairie tree. Other times, he dreamed it had burned, and the ashes spelled out the words, "I tried." He awoke once, sweating, to hear Mr. Devereaux muttering to a neighbor, "We'll need a new boy next year. Tom's probably no good for labor anymore. Leg never healed right." Thomas heard that. He remembered. When the snow thawed, he walked, not far, just out past the boundary of the farm, where wild poplar trees grew and the river slowed. There he dug a hole and buried one of his paper scraps. A letter. No address. No sender. He pressed the dirt flat and whispered, "Don't forget me." Whether he meant the tree or the wind or the land itself, no one can say. But he whispered it all the same. And then he turned back toward the farmhouse, limping slightly, eyes steady, as if returning to a world that had tried to erase him but hadn't quite managed to finish the job. Asterisk. By the time Thomas Layton reached 15, or so he guessed, he had outlived a winter's more and survived a second prairie fire. The Devereaux farm, like many others, had shrunk under the weight of failing crops, market crashes, and quiet desperation. Mr. Devereaux now spoke less in commands and more in size. Marjorie had married a railway clerk and moved to Winnipeg. The house was quieter. Tom, no one called him Thomas anymore, had grown strong but unsmiling. His leg healed crooked, giving him a slight limp, which became a part of him as naturally as his silence. He seldom spoke unless spoken to, and even then gave answers that left no hooks for further questions. But inside, he remembered. He remembered being woken in a bed that wasn't his own. He remembered the white tag tied to his sleeve with his name, age, and destination. He remembered crossing an ocean without understanding why, and arriving in a land that didn't care who he'd been before it claimed him. He had once believed someone might come looking for him. Now, he understood that no one even knew where to look. In the spring of 1933, a new inspector from the Child Immigration Office passed through the region. These visits had grown rare since the Depression deepened. The inspector, a thin man named Mr. Hargreaves, wore round glasses and kept a tin of barley sweets in his coat. He called for Thomas during his check of the Devereaux property. Mr. Devereaux hesitated. "He's not really a child anymore," he said. "Almost a man. That one." Still, the inspector insisted. Thomas met him in the parlor. He stood straight. He kept his hands still. He knew how to be evaluated. The man read from a file. "You are ... Thomas Layton, arrived aboard the SS Montrose, 1926, listed as age 9, assigned to this farm." Well, that was quite some time ago. He looked up. "Do you know your birthday?" Thomas shook his head. "Do you have any living family In England? He paused. I don't know. The inspector scribbled. Have you been attending school? No. Why not? No time. Another scribble. Have you been treated fairly? Here. Thomas hesitated. That moment of pause, barely half a breath, was enough. I see, the inspector said. Well, we'll note that. Before he left, Mr. Hargreaves reached into his pocket. He handed Thomas a barley sweet. For the effort, he said. And ... I'm sorry for whatever happened before you arrived. Thomas didn't reply. He just nodded, placed the sweet in his coat, and walked back to the barn. That summer, he made a decision. He would leave not with drama or revenge, but quietly, like he'd always done everything else. One morning in July, after the chores were finished and the others had gone to town for supplies, he packed a sack with bread, dried beans, and a book he couldn't quite finish. He left a single note. Thank you for what you could offer. I am going to try to become someone who has a name again. And he walked. The road from the farm to the train station was 14 miles. He walked it in a day and a half, sleeping beneath a fence line, eating dry bread the next morning at the station. He met a man named Ernest who drove supply trains. Ernest didn't ask many questions. Thomas offered to shovel coal and help load freight. He didn't say where he was going. By the end of that week, he was gone from Devereux forever. Years later, 1940, a man named Thomas Layton enlisted in the Canadian Army. He listed no next of kin. His birthday was marked as unknown, approx. 1917. His occupation, laborer. His file notes, speaks quietly, reads well, writes poorly. No living relatives on record. He would go on to serve in Belgium and the Netherlands. He returned in 1945, settled in Brandon, Manitoba, worked in grain storage, married late, had no children. In his old age, he would walk slowly down the dirt road behind his house, carrying a notebook in which he had begun to write letters, again, just like the ones from his childhood. Dear me, if you're still here, thank you. Dear ma'am, I think I saw a tree today that looked like the one in our backyard. Or maybe I imagined it. Dear England, I am still waiting to remember the sound of your rain. And one, written with firmer hand than the rest. Dear whoever finds this, I hope someone remembers we were here. That we worked, that we waited, that we didn't vanish, even if the papers said we did. When he died in 1989, there was no funeral. His body was cremated, and the ashes scattered behind the house. But his notebook, brittle, fragile, rain-stained, was found in the attic of his small home. And within it, tucked between pages, was a torn paper scrap from decades earlier. On it was a name, smudged, but still legible. Thomas Layton, age 9, transported, April 3rd, 1926, to Canada. It was the last surviving proof that he had not always been forgotten, and in a museum today, somewhere between an exhibit on rail lines and wheat harvests. That tag lies under glass, captioned simply, a child who left England and became someone else. And perhaps the real question now is not what happened to Thomas, but how many like him vanished into the wind and were never heard from again. Asterisk, in the early spring of 1904, the Belfast Industrial School for Girls received a letter that was not meant to be opened. Its edges were frayed, its ink blurred by damp. Had the address written in a child's careful cursive read, simply, to my mom and dad. Somewhere in Liverpool, England, the matron, a woman with stern spectacles and a voice like dry chalk, held it up to the sunlight, considered the paper, and tucked it in a locked drawer. It would never be delivered. The child who had written it was Annie Doyle. Annie was not special by the standards of history. She was one of many children, orphaned, half-orphaned, or simply discarded, placed in the care of state institutions by virtue of poverty, perceived waywardness, or inconvenient parentage. She had been removed from her family, not due to abuse, but for truancy, her father, a shipwright who drank too much. Her mother, a laundress who worked too hard and lived too long for the liking of social workers at 10 years old. Annie had already scrubbed floors in 3 different institutions. Her hands were pink and raw, the skin cracked beneath her nails, but her voice remained gentle, and she never once cried where someone might hear. The Belfast school where she now lived was a place of iron beds, soap-scrubbed hallways, and silence. Letters were allowed, in theory, but only the ones supervised, dictated, or censored by the school. Real letters and sanctioned, unsupervised, were dangerous. They implied memory, suggested discontent. Annie, however, remembered. And every week, in secret, she wrote. She had a small tin box beneath her, straw mattress. Inside it, wrapped in a handkerchief, were 12 letters, folded tight. Most began the same way. Dear Mom, I hope you are not ill. I had a dream last night that you made bread and let me lick the bowl. I could smell the yeast when I woke. The letters were never stamped. There were no envelopes. Annie didn't know where her mother lived anymore, but she wrote them anyway because the act of writing gave shape to the time that had passed. She signed them with the full name and the year, always adding the phrase, I am still me. In April, a visitor came to the school, a woman from the Bernardos, home for girls in London. She was tall, with auburn hair, a brooch shaped like a thistle, and an accent that softened each word into something tolerable. She was not there to visit Annie specifically, but Annie's name appeared on a list. She was small for her age, obedient, and capable of both sewing and arithmetic, an ideal candidate. Candidate for what? No one explained. By the time Annie learned the truth, her name had already been placed on the manifest of the SS Kensington. She was to be sent to Canada, to begin a better life, to work, learn, and perhaps forget. It would take 3 weeks to arrange the departure. That night, Annie wrote a final letter. Dear Mom and Dad, they are sending me to Canada. I don't know why. God didn't ask. To go. I want to stay, but they say I will be happier there. I don't know what to pack. I only have my comb and the red button you gave me. She folded the letter and placed it in her tin box, but when she woke the next morning, the box was gone. Matron Lister had found it during a surprise inspection. The letters were confiscated, deemed inappropriate, and quietly burned. All except the most recent, which was added to the locked drawer beneath her desk. Annie was not told. She was instead given a donated coat, 2 pairs of woolen socks, and a single bar of lavender soap. The soap was meant to help her smell presentable for the voyage. On April 29, 1904, she boarded the steamship with 97 other children, most under the age of 15. It was cold that morning. The dock workers moved in silence. No families waved goodbye. The children looked forward, not backward. Some cried. Annie did not dot in her coat pocket. She had placed a substitute button, red and worn, from her mother's sewing tin. It would serve as her anchor. The ship's departure was slow, lumbering. The sound of steam and steel, the faint smell of coal, and the endless gray water stretching westward. This became the beginning of her forgetting. No one on the ship asked her about her parents. No one asked her if she wanted to go. She was given biscuits and broth. She was told to be grateful. The children slept in rows. They were not permitted above deck alone. Every night, Annie whispered lines from the letters she could no longer hold, words she had written dozens of times. I am still me. But the farther the ship traveled, the harder it became to believe. Somewhere on the Atlantic, a boy fell ill and was taken below. The matron in charge said nothing to the others. By the next morning, his bed was empty. Annie began to lose track of time. She counted meals instead of days. She no longer remembered the color of the sky in Liverpool, or the sound her mother made when lighting the stove. When the ship arrived in Halifax, the children were lined up and inspected. A photograph was taken grainy and stiff. Annie's name was listed again, this time as a future domestic for a family in Nova Scotia. She was no longer from Belfast, a key. She was no longer from England. She was British stock, a key, willing, trainable. When she stepped onto Canadian soil for the first time, she was 13, so would never see her family again, but far away in a drawer that no one ever opened. Her last letter still said, unread, unanswered, postmarked from nowhere, and in the years that followed, it would remain their fragile witness to a child who believed someone, somewhere, might still care. But would anyone ever find it? Asterisk. When Annie stepped off the ship into the damp air of Halifax, Nova Scotia, the first thing she noticed was the quiet. Not silence, exactly, but a kind of restrained, thick quiet. It's a kind you could feel between your ribs. No crowd greeted them. No cheering, no music. Only officials with pens and ledgers inspecting children like shipments. They were marched through the immigration station in small groups. Each child was given a numbered tag. Annie's Reed Doyle, a female, 13 years. It was not the first time she had been identified by age and sex instead of name, but it was the first time it had felt like a destination. A man in a wide-brimmed hat wrote her name in a ledger and gestured without looking. Bernardo receiving home, North End, and that was it. Her introduction to Canada at the Halifax. Receiving home for girls. Annie was bathed, her hair trimmed, and her possessions, what little their world logged. She was given a uniform blue frock, sturdy boots, and a new metal comb with the letters BH etched into the handle. There were rows of girls like her, all newly arrived, all watching each other, half expecting someone to explain what came next. What came next was training, not schooling. Not rest at training. There were 3 weeks of domestic instruction, in which Annie was taught how to polish brass until her wrists ached, how to kneel while scrubbing without staining her apron, and how to respond politely to commands without pausing to think. They were also taught how to speak with fewer dialect words. A Bernardo instructor gently corrected Annie each time she said mom. It should be mother, she was told. It's more proper. Meals were plain but filling. Porridge, cold boiled potatoes, bread spread thin with margarine. Hunger wasn't the problem. Understanding what her life was now supposed to be, that was harder. Each morning, one girl would be called from the group, assigned to a home. Some cried, some tried to run. Most were gone by dusk, carried off in wagons or cars to farms or townhouses where they would clean floors, care for children, or cook over hot stoves until their hands went numb. Annie waited on her 12th day at the home. She was told her placement had arrived. A Mrs. Ida McKinnon of Truro, Nova Scotia, a widow, 2 children, in need of a house girl. Annie was told it was a great opportunity. Mrs. McKinnon is God-fearing, the instructor said, as though that meant kindness. No one asked Annie if she wanted to go. The next morning, she was handed a parcel with 3 folded blouses, 2 petticoats, and a coat with 1 missing button. Her hair was brushed, her boots were shined. She was placed on a train. The journey to Truro took nearly 4 hours. Force slipped past the windows in long green blurs. The train rocked gently, the whistle occasionally cutting through the quiet, like a question no one dared ask. At the station, a woman waited then, with a hat pinned low and gloves stitched so tightly. They seemed more for appearance than warmth. She introduced herself curtly as Mrs. McKinnon. "Let's not waste time," she said. "We're already behind." They walked in silence to a buggy parked near the edge of the station. Annie's bag was placed in the back without ceremony. The horse clopped steadily over gravel roads lined with damp trees and the occasional clapboard house. The McKinnon property was not large, but it was proper whitewashed walls, a neat porch, lace curtains that barely moved. Inside, Annie met the children. Hugh, aged 7, Lena, aged 5. Both looked at her with suspicion, not curiosity. "You'll sleep in the lean-to," Mrs. McKinnon said.